is our agenda for today's workshop, and I've put some examples along these screens, and this has been shared with you. If you're watching the replay, it'll be in the down bar or over on our website at jschooltech.org. So we're going to talk about why we want to use infographics, some tips and resources, the process that you use in developing infographics. Then we'll dive into the fun part, building content in Illustrator and InDesign. So why do we want to use infographics? Well, this allows graphics to replace text. By replacing text, especially numbers, with graphics, people are better able to digest information and retain it. Infographics really grab our attention. They're bright, they're colorful, we can move through them in different ways. We're using visuals and text in combination with each other. All of that allows readers to retain information. So how do you get started? Well, my first tip for you is to do good research. Begin by thinking, what question do I want to answer? And then seek those answers. That might be through interviews, surveys. Just do good research. Make sure when you're doing this that you're citing good data. So it's a reliable source. Always include that link. Always include that primary source data so viewers can go back and look at that on their own. You're going to end up with more content than you can use in a good infographic. So you're also going to have to set some goals, set some priorities. Think about, again, what question are you answering and creating focus for that infographic. So here's the process that you want to use in going through. So we just talked about, developing your data. When you develop your data, I think it's important to start thinking about the story and even writing the story. Maybe an outline of the story, maybe starting to put some of the data in a spreadsheet. Just get that storytelling process started. Then, when you have the story down, think about how you can use visuals. Think how those visuals can help communicate the story, differentiate from information, draw the viewer's attention. Again, never lose sight of that key question. Next, start thinking about some of your design elements. The most important thing is really space. So using grids, using hierarchy. So thinking dominant elements, dominant text size, how you're flowing through the page. Using levels of spacing, which I've illustrated here so that closer content appears more related. Next, thinking about type. So when you think about type, you want to remember that everything that you are creating has a personality. So think about the personality of your infographic. What does it look like? What is its tone? And then find fonts that help you with that. I've included a couple of links here that can help you with that process, and we'll go through that when we dive into both Illustrator and InDesign. Finally, think about color. So again, how does that relate to the personality, the overall feeling that you are trying to communicate? Have all of these things kind of in mind and planned before you dive into the program. Have things like sketches and some general concepts ready to go. In Illustrator today, we're going to set up a doc, develop some basic shapes, use the shape builder, alignment, swatches, build some graphs, and I've linked some additional tutorials for you on that. In InDesign, we'll be focusing on that spacing, looking at how we can style our text and move those graphics from Illustrator easily into InDesign. Additional resources for you. I've linked Adobe Stock. So Adobe Stock has some great free resources you can use if you need a little help, either with images or graphics. I've also linked Killer Infographics, which is a great source for design inspiration. A lot of our examples that we had were from Killer Infographics, and a lot of great how-tos on their site. And finally, I've linked videos from both JSchool Tech and Adobe. So plenty of resources to get started, but let's go ahead and dive into Illustrator and start building. So I want to start with where we're going to end up. So this is the final example in InDesign, and full disclosure, I'm basing this off of an infographic and some research that Adobe did, because hopefully it will prompt you to think about the importance of creativity in your own career and future. So two purposes here, giving you some information and showing you some skills. So this is where we're headed. And I think that's an important thing to kind of consider as we go through. So I'll just scroll this. And we're going to start in Illustrator, but I want to show you some other resources and kind of how I like to work when I create infographics. So I like to have my data already put into some type of spreadsheet, whether you're using Google Sheets, or in this case, I've done some things in Excel, and I've just broke out some of the data so it's already organized and ready for me to use inside of Illustrator. I also have, and remember that first step in our process is the story. And so again, in Google Docs or Word, have your story actually written out. And so I've created main headline, subhead, and then gone into an explainer. And then I find it helpful to think about things in sections. And so each section could have a subhead, or in my case, a headline and a subhead. And then within that, I'm writing down what content I'm going to have in that. Is it text? Is it graphics? Is it pull quotes? So I have an idea of what I'm going to create. So those are my resources and where we're headed with remaking this Adobe infographic and exposing you to some really cool information about creativity. So we're in Illustrator, and I'm just going to quickly show you how to set up a new document, and then we'll go back to this kind of work in progress page. So when you get to your home page, you have all of your cloud documents, all the work shared with you. When you click on home, you can also see a listing of all your recent documents, and you can either open or create a new document. You can also use one of the quick starts. So like everything in the Creative Cloud, your first choice is where will this end up? So print, screens, those are really your options, and those influence the color space, the resolution, and that. My rule of thumb is if there's any chance that you could end up printing it, always revert to a print because you can easily take that to screen. But once you start screen, it's a little more difficult to take to print. So we'll just select our letter size document, and you can see there is our document. Quick little note about workspaces. I am using the Essentials Classic workspace. So if your workspace looks a little bit different, you might just want to jump up to Window Workspace, switch to Essentials Classic. If it still looks strange, just click the reset button and you'll get back to this workspace. I'm just going to click over here into this starting space and get us going, first of all, on creating that kind of background texture. So one thing about Illustrator work in general and infographics and a lot of artwork, you want to think in terms of layers. And so think about creating a foreground, a middle ground, and a background. And our background can just be a simple color if we want to. But we want to think in terms of how could we add something to this space. So we're going to start by just looking at a couple of examples of backgrounds. So in Illustrator, instead of having pages, you have what are called artboards. So we're going to start by creating a new artboard. And so I've just selected my artboard tool over here. And once we have our artboard tool selected, we can simply click the plus button along the control bar at the top to create a new artboard. Just note you can create many different sizes of artboards within the same document. This is really a great way to do client work, so you can only send them one document, but that has all of the different graphics and content that they asked you to create. So we're going to just create a letter size portrait and hit our plus, and you can see here's our next artboard. Just like with everything else, we can move our artboard around, change where it's located. We're just going to move some of this content because it's overlapping that artboard. And so we're going to have an artboard here, and we'll do another artboard, and we will put this one up here. So we've just added, like I said, kind of pages. So for our first design, we're going to start by creating this kind of jagged look. And I'm going to do this on a smaller scale because you just need to get the main concept. So I'm going to start by just dragging my background. So if I was doing this full page, I would design that full page. Then I'm going to grab my pen tool. And once I have my pen tool selected, I'm going to set this up so that I have no fill. And I'm going to choose a darker stroke just so we can kind of see it as I'm designing. And what I want to do is create geometric shapes, and I always want to cross the outside path. So I want to start outside and create that path. Between each design, I just hit Command and click down, and that gets me a quick temporary selection tool, and then I can come back to my pen tool. And so once you get a couple of these done, you want to start thinking about how you're dividing different segments and what type of shapes are you creating. So, do I want kind of that parallelogram? Do I want a small triangle? What do I want shapes to look like? And so we'll just go across this, and I'm just going to continue to make interesting shapes, crossing outside of the edges and thinking about what kind of shapes I'm leaving as I draw these. And so the cool thing about this is where the creativity comes in, and you can do as many as you want or as few as you want. So now that I've got all my shapes, I'm going to switch to my selection tool, which is just keyboard shortcut V. Select all of my shapes, and now I'm going to divide these. So I'm going to go over to my properties panel, and I'm going to use my Pathfinder and divide those. Now it looks like nothing has happened, but if I ungroup this with a Shift Command G, you can see now I've divided all of these into separate shapes. And now I can start applying color to these shapes. So let's break and talk about color just a little bit. So I have already put a whole bunch of colors into my swatches and things that we're going to use. How did I get those? Here's how we got those colors. So in Window, I went to Color Themes, and this is a great way to start with colors. So a couple of different ways you can work with color themes. Let's say that I know I want to use this blue, and I kind of want to see what colors are available based on that blue. So I can select from active color and then use different color rules. So you can see analogous, monochromatic, complementary, compound, and then I can choose to add those to my swatches. I can also explore. And so I can explore most popular, my themes, random themes, or I can use search terms. So let's say I want to just see, well, what are some business color themes? And there's some business color themes. If I find ones that I like, I just click those 3 dots, add those to my swatches. Once I've added to my swatches, I went the extra step and set up a CC library for me to store all the content that we're kind of creating and using. And that's a great way to make sure that the colors that I've selected can be used across the creative suite. So I could pull this library open in InDesign, Photoshop, Premiere, wherever I end up taking my work. The next thing I've done is I've created some gradients, and these are just based on this base color, but here's how I'm going to use those. I'm going to select my different shapes, grab my eyedropper, and I can just eyedropper in different colors. And so switching between my command and my eyedropper, just kind of like we did before, is going to allow me to select these different colors and kind of get this really unique look in this design. And again, this is where your creativity comes in. So you can experiment with different shapes. You can leave some as they were before. You could even come back in and change your gradients if you find you don't have enough variety. And so I'm kind of liking how that is looking. And again, this is our background. Now, another thing I can do with that background, and I'm going to draw another rectangle, is I can do a color overlay. So I'm just going to do a solid color. We'll make it that light color. And so I'm going to drag this on top. And we're just going to make it half so you can kind of see how this change works. So I'm going to bring up my appearance panel. And my appearance panel has a fill opacity. And when I select that, I have color modes here. And as I change those color modes, you can see I get completely different looks. And so I can also use this in combination with my fill colors. So if I change the fill color of that top and then change my layer modes, I get completely different looks. So if you were curious how we're going to get all those different colors, are we recreating it? No, absolutely not. We're just going to use this color overlay trick. I can find this same fill opacity over here in my properties. If I just click opacity, that also gets me to that same window. Let's do another example. So I'm going to grab my rectangle tool. And so this is a different kind of background texture. And you don't always have to do a pattern or a texture. I'm just trying to expose you to some different ideas. So I've got my color, and I'm going to open up my swatches panel. And I'm going to show you where we get these dot patterns. So I'm going to open up my swatches library. And these are all worth exploring. But we're going to go down to patterns and basic graphics and dots. And that's where I got those dots. So you can experiment with dots and textures and all of that. And they apply just like swatches. So when I select them, that changes them. And here's the trick. So I'm going to take my background shape, and I'm going to copy it with Command C, and then paste it in front with Command F. So I've got 2 shapes in there. And I'm going to add my dot pattern to this top one. Once I add my dot pattern to the top one, I can use that same trick that we used before, and you can see it already had that hard light on it, and just change the look of those dots. And so that can become my background texture. To export these textures out, I have a couple of different options. Probably the best one, so that you don't end up with this huge file, is to export it for some type of screen or as an image. So to do that, we go File, Export. We'll do Export for Screens. And you can see we can export an entire artboard, which, since we'd typically be doing that entire background, we'll go ahead and select that, and I can export it as a JPEG. I want to make sure I'm at 100% if I do that. I could also import that as a scalable vector graphic and just hit export. So that gives you some ideas for backgrounds. Now let's think about designing our icons. So to get us started with our graphics, I want to kind of show you how I've set these up and kind of my process. So I've already written my script, that's completed. And so I go through the script and figure out what visuals will work with the story I'm telling. And then I list these out. So that I'm kind of starting from, I have words, I have key things that reference things back in the script. And you can kind of see these are all the things I've came up with. Now, we won't have time to design all of these, but I'm hoping to give you a basic of what we're designing. So over to our clean artboard, and my first to do is to pull off my tools. So I'm just going to click and hold, let that go, and we now have a floating tool panel. Most graphics that you'll design will be based on basic geometric shapes. And so just some basic shape drawing techniques. If I hold Shift down, I get a perfect proportioned square, circle, whatever I'm drawing. If I hold the Alt down, I draw from the center out. And I can combine these, so Alt-Shift gives me a perfect square from the center out. Now on both your polygon and star tool, when you draw with those, as you need to increase or decrease points, you just use your arrow for that. If you know the exact size of something, you can always just click down and enter the values. Once your shapes are created, you can select them with your black arrow, that is the selection tool, and move them around. Sometimes, and in this case we have a fill, but if you don't, you might need to grab the path on the edge so you can manipulate that. Notice as we have it selected, we have these little rounding corner icons. So I can round the corners, and let's say I just wanted to round one corner. I can switch to my direct selection, which is the white arrow, select just one point, and curve that one point in. My direct selection tool also lets me grab points or paths and extend them. So I can manipulate any shape into something new. Switch back to my selection tool. Other things I can do, I can quickly copy content. So I have it selected, and I'm just going to click down with my Alt, and you can see I'm getting that white black arrow, and that'll allow me to copy it. I can also hover on the outside, rotate it. If I need to arrange objects in different ways, I can right-click, arrange, send objects in whatever direction I like. I can also use, when I right-click, the transform menu, which allows me to do things like rotate, scale, and make copies. So for example, if I wanted to rotate this shape, and let's say I wanted it 5 times in a circle, I can preview what that looks like, and then I can make copies. And if I want to repeat, I can just Command D and create all kinds of interesting shapes with those basic methods. Now the real power comes in when I start using shapes together. So let me clear the decks here, and we'll create some shapes. So I'm going to grab my ellipse. I'm going to just draw a person icon. So we're going to start with our shoulders, and I've drawn my basic body shape, and I want to cut that in half. So I'm drawing a rectangle over that. Switch to my selection tool. I'm going to select them both. So they're both selected, and make note how this top shape is overlapping. In order for me to cut out or combine or do anything with my shape builder tool, I need overlapping paths. Over in the toolbar, here's my shape builder tool. It has the circles with the selection tool on top of it. And you can see as I come over here, it gives me some highlights. Now there's 3 parts to the shape builder tool. If I just click and drag, I've created one shape. If I click 3 separate times, I've created 3 separate shapes that I could color differently. And if I hold my Alt key down and drag, I can subtract shapes. Now once my shape is created, I can still manipulate that new shape. So I've got the bottom part of my body. I'm going to draw my head. So I'll grab my ellipse, and notice I can get these smart guides. So those are going to help me decide where to draw. So now I'm going to use those shortcuts we learned earlier. Alt to draw from the center out, Shift to do a perfect circle, and there we go. Now if I wanted to scale this, all I need to do is use the same operation, Shift and Alt, and I can scale that in proportion from the center. So first thing I'm going to do here is use this shape to cut out that kind of notch. So I'm going to select them both, go back to my shape builder, and again I'm going to Alt drag. Now I'm going to actually Command Z that, because here's where you can start getting clever. I can keep a copy of this. That's going to be my head. This is going to be the part that I cut away. And now that head perfectly will fit in that notch, and I can always use that Shift Alt to scale it a little bit. And there's my person icon. So it's ready to go. Now the cool thing about InDesign and Illustrator is when I copy this over to InDesign, I can still recolor it. InDesign and Illustrator are both what's called vector-based programs. So that means InDesign recognizes Illustrator's lines. So I can simply design in black and white and then do whatever I want with my icons. Let me show you one other example just so we can get some practice in. So one of the icons I'm using for this project is a wrench icon. So let's work on drawing that. So I'm going to start with drawing a nice circle, and then I want a rounded rectangle for the bottom of my wrench. So I'm going to rotate that in, and I'm liking that and kind of figuring out how I want to get that centered. And so I like that shape, and what I can do is copy this to dial out that wrench part on the other side. And then maybe down here, I want a little circle. Another little drawing tip, if you hold your space bar down, you can move as you draw. So we have everything. So now we're going to kind of organize these. So we can't do all of our operations at once. So I want to kind of do these in stages. So my first stage is cutting this circle out. So to my shape builder, Alt, and I'm just going to subtract that middle shape out. Back to my selection tool, I'm going to select these 2 shapes, and I'll cut this part out. So grab my shape builder, again select and remove, select my shapes again. Now I want to combine, back to the shape builder, and now I can just drag. So one of the things you want to think about as you build shapes is the overall look and appearance. So let's just do a little comparison. I'll draw out 3 copies. And so we'll say our first one is kind of our neutral one, and it's going to have a 1-point line. Notice as we scale, our stroke changes. So always good to kind of reselect everything and check your stroke before final production. We'll do a dark one there. And for this one, let's go ahead and color this. And we're going to use that color for the fill and this color for the stroke. And so you can kind of see there's some real big differences. One of the things I like to do to kind of ground my shapes is use a shape behind them to kind of give them a place to rest. Again, what am I really thinking? Foreground, middle ground, background. So once I have my icons created, just like I mentioned with that person icon, I can copy and paste those over to InDesign, or I can add those to my library. Remember, our Creative Cloud library works across our suite, so I will select my icon, choose the plus mark, and add my graphic. And so now that graphic is in there, I can click it, rename it, and basically drag and drop from the library when I'm in InDesign. All right, and our next step is going to be designing some graphs in Illustrator. Illustrator is a great graph builder. So first thing is to understand what type of graph you need. And I won't get super into this, but easy way to remember is if it is a pie chart, it is a part of 100, chances are that's going to be demographic data. So anything related to demographics is usually in a pie chart. Anytime you're comparing content is going to be some type of bar graph. And in this case, we're comparing 2 different things, so we're using a stacked bar. And always worth your time to make sure that you are using the correct type of graph for your information. Several great places online where you can learn more about that. So we're going to start by going to Object. Let me deselect this graph first. Object, Graph, and Type. And so here is where I can choose the graph type that I'm going to use, all the styling for it. A couple of basic tips. I do not like to have a style, such as a drop shadow, when I do my designing. I always add that later. I can edit the tick values, so that's these values down here. So let's say I did a survey and I said, how much money do you spend on the weekend? And I started at 5, not at 0. Those tick values would need to reflect that. Otherwise, our data is skewed. And my category access. So again, how many tick marks I'm going to have, where's that going to be located? So let's go back to our graph options. And in this case, we are creating the stacked bar. I am fine with having the default values for this, and I can always come in and change these if I want. So I'm going to hit OK. And so now in my toolbar, the stacked bar graph is available. So I'll select that and I can draw that to whatever size I want. And I can already tell, these aren't really kind of, well, let me get some data plugged in there. And this is where having things in Excel is super handy, because I can just copy and paste this right into Illustrator. And we'll hit our check mark. And there's our bar chart. Now, anything I want to do with editing this content can be done in InDesign. So if I want to apply my colors, if I want to change the fonts, all of that can happen over inside of InDesign. Now when I'm done, I shut this down, but here's the cool thing. Let's say I've saved this, and we'll even use this graph. So I did this a while ago, but I can come back in, go to Object, Graph, and Data, and there's my spreadsheet again. So if I make any mistakes in data entry, I can always come back from that. All right, so now we're ready to move over to InDesign and build our infographic. Okay, so just a reminder where we are headed. This is the document that we are going to build. We may not get all this completed, but hopefully it'll give you a good idea of how to get started with this. So a couple just reminders and tips. Our infographic should capture people's attention. So think about colors and space and words and headlines that we can use to grab their attention. It needs to be elevated and shareable so that we're creating content that people can share easily. When they're reading it, they want to get that information fast. So make it clear. Make all the numbers you use very digestible and understandable. So I'm going to go ahead and go back to our home page, and we're going to create a new document. And just like in Illustrator, our first choice is where are we going with this? So in this case, we're going to say we're going to print this document. And by default, we have our sizing in picas. If that is confusing, you can always switch that to inches. Now, I know that this is going to be a very tall document, so I can change it and make this a custom size. So now that's roughly 8 by 16. I could create multiple pages. We're only going to have one, and then I want to create a column grid. So your column grid is going to be what helps you space and organize your content. I recommend if you're getting started, somewhere between 3 and 7 is a good number. I'm kind of envisioning kind of a very formal design here, so I'm going to do an even number of columns to make that happen. I'm also just going to leave my default margins the way they are, and I can preview this document to see if this is in fact what I want. Now, before I hit create, let's talk about, well, why didn't we just do this all over in Illustrator? Well, there's a couple of reasons. One is grids and guides. So you have to manually create grids and guides in Illustrator. There is a background grid you can use, but this type of column grid is not available in Illustrator. The other reason is text. And I find paragraph type text to be much easier to work with inside of InDesign. Finally, whenever I'm going to be combining text plus images plus graphics, InDesign is the best pagination system to make that happen. So I'm going to go ahead and hit create, and then we'll just quickly save this. So we have our background ready to go here, our page. And I'm just going to open up our Creative Cloud library that we had over in Illustrator. So there's all our colors, there's all our graphics, and we're ready to go with our design. I'm actually going to create a text box off to the right, the left-hand side, and I'm going to file place. If you remember, we have that script, and I'm just going to place that in there because this has all of my headline text, everything in here. It's going to make it so easy for me to copy and paste content back and forth. So first thing I want to add is our background, and here you have a couple of the ones that I designed previously that I can use for my background. So I'm going to grab this one and just open it and place it. Now, notice it's not covering the entire graphic. I can just copy it, and drag it down. Remember, this is a background graphic. So we have a lot of latitude with that. So our first shape that we want to think about is our headline space. And we really want that to grab people's attention. So I'm going to grab my shape tool and I'm going to draw a rectangle along the top here. And I'm going to fill that with black. So I'm going to do a reverse headline in here. And I'm going to ignore the margins. I'm going to have a bleed for that black headline, but the text and content is going to be in reverse. So here's how easy this is. So I'm going to take my headline, I'm going to copy it, I'm going to paste it, I'm going to select, change the size. Now in my design, I'm envisioning kind of having creative problem, and then solving is going to be styled separately. So the way I like to work is if I'm going to style them differently, I create different text boxes. And I'm going to create an all caps here. And I'm also keeping an eye on everything with my grid. So notice how the M in problem is stopping right before that column guide. We're going to do the same thing with the G here. And I can always make that shape a little longer. Okay. And then now we have our subhead. So same thing. And so some of the things you want to consider as you start to pick your fonts is readability. And that's one of the reasons why we are reversing this text, is for readability. The other thing I see students, kind of struggle with is sizing. So really what I want to think about is how it fits within the grids, and then what is the hierarchy. So it's obvious with these sizes that this is my headline, this is my subhead. And so let's style this now, because I'm not liking the default. We never want to just be default. And so I want something a little bold. I like the idea of using the serifs. So I can search, I go over to my character panel. And actually, let's pull out our character panel so we can see it a little bit better, not confined to our panel. So I'll bring it up here. And notice I have that same search. So I can filter all of my existing fonts. And we said I kind of want that big, bold slab serif. I could add other categories to it. Let's see what I'm really kind of liking. Roboto slab. Let's see how that looks. I forgot to highlight, so let's get that. And notice when I changed the font, it changed the size a little bit. So I'm just going to need to make that a little bit smaller to fit within that column guide. And let's use the same font. So here's a great tip. So I can't quite grab that solving because the text box here is larger. So if I go to Object, Fitting, Fit Frame to Content, it fits. So that's a great, and you can also use the keyboard shortcut, which is Option, Command, and C. Let's get this changed. And we're going to change it to Roboto slab, bold. And this one's going to need to be smaller too. And definitely taller. So actually we can make this a little bit. So how do you know that your headline text fits? Well, if you cannot type an XX after it, then that headline fits. Now here's a great trick. We might be using this headline further down the page. So we're going to set up paragraph styles. So I've selected that text box, And over my text style, I'm just going to hit plus for a new paragraph style, and I'm going to call this main headline and hit return. So let's say if I came over here and I had other text, I could just highlight that text, style that as main headline. Save you a lot of time as you go through. Let's keep our headline the same, but maybe let's do a little something different with it. I don't know if I like the bold in that case. Let's try regular and see if we like that. And one thing I'm noticing about this is I'm not liking the space between the lines. So that's the leading over here, and I'm just going to decrease that. Single spacing matches your font. Now let's get into my idea for this special design here. So I've created it in a separate text box, and now I'm going to create an outline. So I'm going to go to type and create outlines. So now InDesign thinks that that text is shape. Since that text is shape, what I can do is grab and I just did a quick screenshot of our background and pasted it in there. So it looks like some interesting texture. I'm also going to make sure that the top of my subhead aligns with the top of my headline so that that stays nice and even. So I feel good about our headline design. Let's dive into designing our first text box, which is an explainer. And again, remembering readability. So I'm going to draw my rectangle. I'm going to go over to my CC libraries, and I want to use that blue color. I'm going to grab my text. So the idea of your explainer and your infographic is that it's going to answer the 5 W's and H. The explainer is really to add those 5 W's and H, answer the why of the story quickly and easily for readers. And our body copy really doesn't need to be anything too big. Now our explainer we might want to bring up a little bit. So let's start experimenting with that. So I'm going to highlight my text. And same thing as I did before, I can start searching for different fonts, different styles that I want. So this time I'm kind of thinking instead of a slab serif, just a regular serif. I wanted to point out while we're in here, I can also find more fonts. When I click find more, I'm actually going to be searching for fonts on the Creative Cloud. So it's going to search for all the Adobe fonts, and look how it's giving us that nice preview so I can kind of see what that text is. Now I saved us a little bit of time, and I'm already kind of digging using Lato as my font, and Lato is actually a sans serif. I forgot that. So we can style this. I'm just going to do a Lato regular. I don't need it to be 12 point. We'll make it 10 point. And now that I've got this style, I can also add that to my paragraph styles. So I'm going to add a new paragraph style. I'm going to call this copy. Now, do you see how wide that text is? I want to divide that into some paragraphs. Oops. And so I'm just going to scroll down on my properties panel. And at the bottom, there's a text frame. And I am just going to change, not looking right, there we go. Change that to 2 columns. Now let's talk about what columns work and what columns don't. Notice that this column divide right here, that gutter, is matching up with this gutter. That's what I want. This does not. This does, but they're super small. But I'm breaking it over here. So really the only answer is 2 columns. Adjust these so that I have a really nice, clear explainer. So let's start getting into adding our graphics. To dig into the next portion, we're going to replicate that same technique that we used in Illustrator. So again, I'm going to draw my rectangle. I'm going to hop over to my CC libraries and pick our color. And I'll even pick the same color we had before, but now I'm going to add that appearance to it. So to add the effect in InDesign, what we need to do is go to our window and effects. And here's that same layer mode that we had earlier, and we can just apply whatever layer mode we want. And so I'm kind of liking that hard light effect. And do note that effects can make things run slower. So if that's really bothering you, maybe layer that in before you export your background. All right, so now I'm ready to build our content. And so I'm going to grab my type tool. I'm going to grab our first section headline. And I just want to point out, if you've noticed, I've been copy and pasting my text over here. If I paste in here, it's going to fill into this shape. And I kind of want my shape and my text to remain independent. Now, I did sneak in here and add my section headline style. So we're repeating that same Roboto slab that we had up in the headline, just doing a different size with it. So there is our headline, and then let's use that Command-Alt-C trick. Now we'll grab our subhead, and you can see how easy it is when we get our text in there. So let me see what we want to do. Now, as I put my section in here, and this is my section subhead, I'm thinking I want to differentiate this even more from that subhead. So I'm going to grab my shape tool. I'm going to grab my rectangle tool, and I'm going to draw another rectangle shape. And again, notice I'm staying on my guides. And just like we rounded shapes inside of Illustrator, we can round shapes inside of InDesign. We do it a little different. So I made my shape, I grab my selection tool, and I'm going to click on that little yellow square, and that is what allows me to round my corners. So I'm going to round my corners, and I want a little bit of contrast there. So I'm going to add that blue, and I really like that. So now I just need to bring these in correct arrangement. So again, just like Illustrator, we'll right-click, arrange, bring to front. And so now our headline is nicely placed inside our shape. And I can shift-click both of those and group them together, make it a little easier for me to work with as we go forward. Now we're ready for our first section of some graphics. And so I'm going to scroll over to my, actually, we're going to copy and paste this one. So copying and pasting, we'll hop over to Illustrator, and we're going to copy and paste these two. So I'm just going to select Command-C, hop back over to InDesign, Command-V as in vampire, and those came in. I'm going to ungroup those. All right. So we're going to move this, and again, I'm looking at my columns, so he's going to be right there in my columns, and we're going to change colors with this. So I'm going to pick, I want this nice green, but I think I just want a stroke. Like, I think that's a little too much. So what I can do is swap the fill and the stroke, change my fill to none, and then maybe bump up that stroke. So that's why InDesign and Illustrator get along so great, is look at all the changes I made just copying and pasting it. I'm using my guides to make sure that those are aligned. And here's how I can do this. He's just going to copy that content. So again, using that eyedropper tool to copy that content. So the content we have for this section is our comparison chart of educators and policymakers. This is just an alternative way to present content. So these were the statements that educators and policymakers were given, and this is how many of them agree. And so we've kind of explained that in our headline and subhead. And as opposed to listing it out, here I have a nice, neat chart to explain that. So we created layers with circles and our data and using our color story. And so I'm just going to copy. So you get an idea of kind of how we're designing and how we're falling into the grids here. So our next section, we're going to actually bring in that graph data. And so you already know how to do the headline and subhead, so I would copy and paste that same style over. And then I just wanted to show you how we can get that graphic and start modifying it. So back over to Illustrator, here's that chart we made. Now, remember I said we can easily copy and paste? Text doesn't always paste correctly. So I'm going to copy and paste our graph, and I need to ungroup it because we need to scale it, color it. There's all kinds of things that need to happen right now. So I'm going to ungroup it, and notice when I do, this text is all broken up. So I'm going to undo that, and I'm going to show you how I like to bring in charts. So I'm going to grab my direct selection tool, and what I want is this content. And really, I'm only bringing these over so I don't forget what the categories are. So I'm going to copy it. Now notice I'm starting to run out of space. This is kind of the neat thing you can do in InDesign. So I'm just going to go back to my document setup, and I'm going to make this document taller. I want to use the same kind of colorways I'm doing now, but we're doing a lot of these rounded edges, and really because that contrasts nicely with that background that we created. So let's think about how we could replicate that with this. I'm going to scale this down a little bit more. So what I can do is use some interesting colors. So I'm going to grab my eyedropper, and I want it to be that orange color, orange, green. I also want to round it a little bit. So I'm going to round this because I want to get that same kind of look. So I've created that nice rounded shape. Now I'm going to create that same rounded shape here. And I'm going to move this so that there's that overlap. Now to make life easy for me, again, we're going to use that same technique with the eyedropper that we've used before. So Command select, eyedropper click, Command pull that back. And so we can go on through the grid doing this. Now, really this background, as I'm designing this, I'm really not liking that part of it. So I'm just going to delete it and these numbers. Well, if I don't have my numbers, and I should have edited those anyway, how are we going to know? Well, I can just add the numbers here in my chart, and I can add my text. So let's hop over to my final example, and you can see we've got our text, we've got our shapes, we've got our key, and we could go and add those numbers if we want, but really, do we need to? And sometimes it's just worth exploring that concept. So one final thing I want to show you is how you can bring these graphics. So these are the ones we created and saved to our CC library. And so we would have these in the next section down. We just drag and drop. And they can be scaled just by holding Shift and Command and moved wherever we want. So now those are created. Now these, we actually can't go in and change the color and shape since they came from our library. So let me show you how that final section wrapped up. This is the one I did in the red, so just changing that cover color, a little pull quote, and then here's how we used all of our icons in this category. Final steps with the infographic, and I'm actually going to show you this on here in our final one. If I hit W, you can see there's our column guides, but I also have this background grid. I'm going to hide that for a hot second. So there's two types of space you kind of want to check at the end of your work. One is the grids, and I want to make sure that I'm not violating my grid. So I'm going through, I'm checking, I'm looking at these icons. They're nice and even in that. Notice these circles and text are in this column. This one is in that column. All of my text here. Oh, wait a minute. This text is overlapping a bit. So I need to make that a little bit smaller, which means I can move these bars over a bit. So you just want to make sure that you are always staying in your columns. And that might mean that you need to change some sizing, move things a little bit. So I polish all of that. But the next thing you want to look for after you do your grids is your space between objects. So I'm going to bring back up that document grid. So each of these squares is one pica. Remember when I talked hierarchy of space, content that is further away is less related. And as long as you set your rules and follow your rules, you can use whatever rules you like. So let's say that I want 2 columns or 2 picas, 2 squares of content between each of these objects. So I just need to make sure there's 1, 2. This one is a little bit off, so I might need to move this section up a little bit. And again, maybe move this headline up. And so I'm just evaluating distance between all of my content. When I get down here to related content, they can be a lot closer to each other. The space between each section might be 2 or 3 picas, but within, I want them to be closer. So let's edit this whole area right here. So I'm going to move my headline up so that's only 1 pica away from this top. I've already got my distance there. I'm going to grab my subhead, and it's only going to be a pica away from that headline. And same thing with these, and I'm making sure that I'm not breaking my grid as well. And then I'd move this 1 pica away. So you can see how I was having a lot of extra space in there, and I might want to separate that out. So that's your final stage. And it behooves you to kind of work down your page. So check it left to right and top to bottom as you do your sizing and spacing. And that's your final step. I'm going to go ahead and hide those so that we can get a good look at our final example. And I'd go through and check all the sizing here, but I wanted to show you a couple of tricks. So we have all of this content together. I need to collect all of this. So I'm going to package it. Now packaging, it pulls all of your images, all of your fonts, a PDF, all that good stuff together. And the reason why we want to do that is because if you're like me, you got stuff everywhere. This gathers it all together in one nice folder. And it's especially wonderful if you are using a lot of different shared devices. So there's my folder. It's got my fonts, got my linked documents. So there's all my artwork, everything in there ready to go. Notice all of that artwork was the content that was in our CC library, and now it's coming in as just its own Illustrator file. So pretty cool. It also means if we were doing this for a client, we could share this entire folder with them. Another way to share work with clients is to use our Share for Review button. So I'm going to click the Share for Review. Notice we could package it there as well. And I'm going to make this a public link. If I made it an invite only, I would want to make sure that I knew their Adobe ID. So here is our public link. And I could just copy that, paste that into an email that to a client, and they can then open up this document and start making comments and critiques. So a great way to share work. Finally, we can publish online. So same button, I'm going to go publish online. This is also available in your file menu along with recent published documents and your publish online dashboard. Cool thing about publish online is I can always update documents once I create their online link, and that link doesn't change. You have a couple of options here, so I can allow people to download this as a PDF. I can allow people to share or not to share. And here's my advanced, so I'm going to have that image, or I can choose a separate image. So when I publish it, all right, so our link is ready. So we're going to go ahead and view that link. And there our document is. So it views the whole thing. They can download it, they can share it. And if it was a multiple page document, we could view all the thumbnails. So hopefully that gets you started on creating an amazing infographic. Remember, J-School Tech is always here to help you create content and build your skills. Reach out to us if we can help you.